you. And also, I do have books for sale here. The Dark Voyage is for $25, $35 on Amazon.com. And the other books are $20, and I'd be glad to sign them. And they make great presents of all kinds. So it's a fascinating history. And I will begin. The contrast is glaring in the extreme. On the one hand, the American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783 was a glorious struggle for the causes of liberty, equality, and the dignity of the individual. Thomas Jefferson's rousing words in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, have inspired millions across the globe and in our nation for almost 250 years. And they resonate today in Ukraine. The word men originally meant adult white men, but it's been expanded over the years to include women and persons of all colors and creeds and races. Democracy, the rule of the many, not just the few, representative and balanced government, the rule of law. These and more are gifts that the United States has helped to bestow upon the world. Yet at the same time that the American Revolution was just about to begin, one of the worst tragedies in world history was continuing unabated: the Atlantic slave trade. European and American merchants sent ships across the ocean to purchase African captives and carry them across to the Caribbean islands, to Brazil, and to North America, what would become the United States. At the time, Great Britain was the leading slave trading country in the world. But other European countries were involved too, such as Portugal and Brazil, France. So between 1771 and 1775 alone, on average, each year more than 90,000 African captives were taken from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. And there the Africans were subjected to a life of permanent bondage, and their children were consigned to the same unimaginably awful fate. The captives were taken away from their families forever, from their friends, and thousands of them died on what was called the Middle Passage, the 6-week or so voyage from Africa to North America. It was a horrible, abominable trade, and it's mind-boggling to believe that it ever existed, especially by today's standards. Here's a chart you can see by country. Now this is not the entire slave trade period, but during this long period, Great Britain ended in 1807, its slave trade. Great Britain was the leader. And Portugal, mostly Brazil, almost all Brazil. So they started a lot earlier than Britain and ended a lot later too. You can see the United States, not as much. Here's a British slave ship called the Blandford, and it's kind of celebrating here, this painting. There's a slave trading scene in Africa, and it's kind of celebrating that part.
How many were in the crew?
How many were in the cruise? 15 to 30. They typically had relatively more crews than any other ship because they wanted to be careful about slave insurrections and that kind of thing. But I'll answer any questions after the presentation. In the first 3 quarters of the 18th century, Great Britain was the world's leading slave trading country. The year 1775, which was so important, Battle of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, British merchants from Liverpool, London, and Bristol annually sponsored about 150 to 200 slave ships each year to sail to the west coast of Africa and then across to the Caribbean, on average taking about 40,000 enslaved people per year. The British vessels transported their captives across the Atlantic Ocean and landed them mostly in the British Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua. In the quarter century prior to the American Revolution, Great Britain's domination of the Atlantic slave trade peaked, as you can see from this chart.
Did they all go in the triangle trade?
Yes? Yep.
Not to,
I'll get to that.
Not to Britain or to Portugal or any place like that.
Yeah, they all had their own triangle trade. Yeah. Matter of fact, I was just about to speak about that right now. A British slaving voyage typically had 3 legs, thus giving rise to the name triangle trade. Starting from Great Britain, the slave ship would typically take guns and ammunition that African chieftains wanted, textiles, porcelain, manufactured goods from England. And these were used to trade with African chieftains and white traders as well for African captives. Here's another slave trading scene in color. The slave ship is out in the bay. Then the ship carried the captives across the Atlantic Ocean, the dreaded Middle Passage. The ship's destination, as I said, was typically Jamaica, Barbados, or Antigua, where the surviving captives were sold to local plantation owners. Next, the ship's captain purchased sugar and byproducts of sugar, molasses, and rum, to bring back to Britain to sell to British wholesalers. Sugar was the key. Europe craved sugar, which was almost unknown to most Europeans before the 17th century. England in particular loved sugar. They put in their cookies, cakes, tea, and coffee. But so did all Europeans. The value of sugar imports and related products, molasses and rum, far exceeded, was the most valuable import of Britain up until 1820. And it far exceeded even tobacco in Virginia and Maryland and rice and indigo in South Carolina. Slave labor was indispensable to the production of sugar. Plantation owners on the islands used gangs of enslaved laborers and workers to cultivate, harvest, and process the sugar cane. The hardest job was to process the sugar cane. You had to very quickly get the sugar cane into these huge hot vats that had to be stirred. And they would rotate the planting season so that there was always a harvest going on for 6 months of the year. All this great increase in our treasure, wrote a British observer as early as 1729, proceeds chiefly from the labor of Negroes in the plantations. Now, if slave labor was the key to successful sugar plantations, the African slave trade was the key to the continuation of slave labor. This was because of the need of sugar plantation owners each year to replenish their slave stock by purchasing new captives. An outstanding feature of the British Caribbean plantation slavery in the mid-18th century was that natural births of enslaved people failed to exceed natural and unnatural deaths. This was primarily because of the death rates among the enslaved in the British Caribbean was shockingly high. Poor food, primitive living conditions, and overwork left enslaved people vulnerable to deadly diseases. And the child mortality rate was also abominable. The first 3 years or so of a newly imported enslaved individual's life was called the seasoning period, and it took a heavy toll. Arriving in a weakened state already from being on a slave ship, the new arrivals had to adjust to new work, new rules, new food, new diseases. An estimated 20% of enslaved Africans and captives who were brought to the Caribbean died in the seasoning period. Here's another African slave trading scene. The Africans who are rowing are free blacks who are rowing the enslaved captives to the European slave ship. This is a famous picture of the Brooks showing the tight packing of the captives underneath the holds. First, just horrible, not much room. Here's a abolitionist, Olada Equiano. He actually is one of the few who gave a recollection in writing of his time as going across the Middle Passage. And he actually earned his freedom, gained his freedom, and became a well-known abolitionist in London in the 1790s. Now, British Caribbean planters intentionally provided their enslaved people with minimal food, shelter, and clothing. They made the mind-boggling decision that it was cheaper to buy new captives every year than to pay for better living conditions for the enslaved people they already had. As a result of the high mortality rate among the enslaved and the low natural birth rate, British Caribbean planters had to import massive numbers of captives just to maintain their enslaved populations. And here you can see, just in this 25-year period, Jamaica brought in 230,000, Barbados 110,000. Just amazing numbers. Perhaps the most devastating statistic is to compare the numbers of Africans carried to the British Caribbean to their populations when slavery was prohibited. Historian Adam Hochschild writes, when slavery ended in the United States in 1865, less than 500,000 slaves imported over the centuries had grown to a population of nearly 4 million. By comparison, notes the same author, when slavery ended in the British Caribbean in 1834, total slave imports of well over 2 million left a slave population of only 670,000. And the author called it, a real slaughterhouse. Readers may be surprised to learn that merchants in what would become the United States, and later would become the United States, what was the United States, played a relatively small role in the African slave trade. While the trade lasted, they carried a total of about 292,000 captives across the Atlantic and outfitted about 2.4% of all voyages. Here's a advertisement for a slave trading outfit by Henry Lawrence, who was one of the great slave traders in the colonial times, and during the American Revolutionary War he would be the president of the Continental Congress. Now, Rhode Island dominated the slave trade among the 13 mainland colonies. So there wasn't a lot in the 13 mainland colonies, but Rhode Island dominated it more than 50%. The rest came from New York City, Boston, and some other smaller New England ports. Newport by far was the dominant port within Rhode Island. More than 90% in colonial times came from Newport. Now, why tiny Rhode Island dominated the slave trade isn't clear. My belief is that the bigger cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, they had big hinterlands. They could draw on lots of farms for excess produce. But Rhode Island was pretty small. The South County was pretty nice here, the Narragansett country here, for creating horses and cattle and cheese, but relatively small. So they had to look somewhere else if they wanted to have a maritime commerce. And they found, hey, if we pick up molasses from Jamaica, we can bring it back to Newport, distill it into rum. Most of the rum we'll sell to people in New England, but about 25% of it they realized they could make some profits by selling it in the African slave trade. African sellers of captives sometimes called Rhode Island slave ship captains rum men. Yet while the importance of the slave trade to Newport's economy was significant, its role has been exaggerated. Newporters recently claimed that their city's historic houses were built on the slave trade. Yet on the average in the 1760s and 1770s, Newport sent out about 350 voyages total on the North American coastal trade and about 180 voyages in the foreign trade, so more than 500. Yet on the average, Newport sent about 20 ships to Africa for the slave trade per year. So that's only about 3.6% of all the voyages. Now, the slave voyages should be counted more because it took a big investments to invest in a slave voyage. They would be gone for more than a year. But still, my number comes up to maybe 14%. Here's a great historical Rhode Island painting. It's called the Rhode Island Captains in Suriname. They're not necessarily slave traders, although I'm sure some of them were. This is in the St. Louis Museum of Art. And there's an African here, a servant, and one here, and one here. This guy's having his someone vomit in his pocket and having rum poured down his neck. So, couple of future Rhode Island governors there. Now, while Rhode Island was a small player in the worldwide slave trade, carrying in the average 2,400 African captives per year, as the decades passed, it got to be a lot of people. In all, 59,000 Africans were involuntarily taken aboard Rhode Island vessels during the colonial period. The human suffering Rhode Island slavers caused African captives and their families left behind is impossible to measure. But matters were beginning to change. The American Revolution was a crucial catalyst for the worldwide anti-slavery movement. It was, in fact, prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, the most important event in America promoting the anti-slavery cause. When the rebellion against the Crown rule began, there was little anti-slavery activity anywhere in the world. Britain's anti-slavery movement really didn't begin until about 1787. As with any great worldwide movement, the anti-slavery campaign made slow progress, but it definitely made progress during the American Revolution. Before the war, every single colony had slaves, including those in the North. And Rhode Island had the highest percentage of slaves in the North, mostly because of the Narragansett country here and the Newport slave trading. But by the time the American Revolution ended, and years passed after the American Revolution, slavery ended in the North. And the slave trade, almost every colony and state, they are now states, ended the slave trade. So this was, at least legally, this was probably the first time in history, in world history, that this happened. So it was a major leap forward for the causes of ending the African slave trade as well as slavery itself. But, as we know, slavery continued in the South, South Carolina and Georgia in particular during the Constitutional Convention, insisted on continuing slavery. Thus, there was still a long road ahead to ending slavery and treating black people as political and social equals. Now, with the American colonists denouncing a British plot to enslave them by imposing taxes without representation, it wasn't surprising that some patriots figured out, hey, we're actually enslaving people in our midst. As early as 1763, the great patriot orator James Otis of Massachusetts, in an influential pamphlet arguing that colonists should not be taxed without their consent, he asserted that there were laws higher than those of Parliament. While not necessary to make his argument, Otis delved into race relations. He exclaimed, "The colonists are by law of nature freeborn, as indeed are all men, white or black. Does it follow that 'tis right to enslave a man because he is black?" Speaking of the African slave trade, he said, "Nothing can be said in favor of a trade that is the most shocking violation of the law of nature." Here's a pamphlet called The Oration by John Allen, and it's actually one of the most popular, most read pamphlets in colonial times, and he was arguing that the sinking of the Gaspee was an important act, opposing British tyranny. In the fourth edition, he suddenly adds several paragraphs that were very anti-slavery and against the slave trade. So we're seeing more congregational ministers and Baptist ministers in particular coming out against it. In the lead up to the American Revolution, most legislatures in the 13 colonies passed laws to limit the immigration of enslaved people into their colonies. But in Britain, in London, those laws were all revoked. Britain didn't want to do anything to interfere with its profitable slave trade. My new book brings together the glory of the American Revolutionary War and the horror of the African slave trade together in one tale. And the tale is told through the extraordinary voyage of the Rhode Island privateer Marlborough to West Africa and the men who sailed on it with the bold goal of attacking the British slave trade in Africa. Now, why would a privateer sail to faraway Africa? Privateers typically sail to the Caribbean, where the merchant ships were, or they go up the Canadian coast, where Britain was sending its ships to supply its army and navy in North America. But Africa, no privateer was known to go there before. The story starts in Providence, Rhode Island, with John Brown, who's the main investor and the mastermind behind this voyage. Brown, as we know, was a member of a famous merchant family. He also organized the raid and attack of the Gaspee. He was an early investor in an iron foundry that made about 1,000 cannon. A lot of them went to privateers. When the war started, he made more profits as a military contractor hired by Congress to get gunpowder, which was in short supply, and other supplies. There's a portrait of John Brown about 1790 by Edward Malbone. This is in the New York Historical Society. In 1776 and 1777, Brown got really rich as an investor in privateers. During the war, the Continental Navy was no match for the Royal Navy, which by far was the most powerful navy in the world. America's most effective weapon at sea was privateering, the operation of privately owned commerce raiders. From British ships, Americans captured gunpowder, weapons, food, blankets, and other supplies desperately needed not only by the Continental Army, but by its citizens. Privateers were not pirates. Pirates operated outside of any government oversight and solely for their own personal gain. Privateers were sanctioned by the government to attack only enemy shipping. They were required to follow an elaborate set of rules. For example, they had to treat prisoners humanely. They couldn't attack neutral vessels. And if they violated those rules, they could lose their commission or end their prize. Once an enemy vessel was captured, the captain of the privateer would typically select from his crew a captain to take the prize ship, sail the prize ship back, and a small crew to sail it back to a safe port in North America or maybe the French Caribbean. But if it was supposed to go to America, an admiralty court would conduct a trial by jury to determine whether the prize was lawfully taken from an enemy combatant. If it was, it would be sold at a public auction. And the net proceeds would be divided, 50% to the investors and 50% to the officers and the crew. Here's an ad for an auction going on sale of captured cargo, and also the captured ship itself would be sold. Many who enlisted with American privateers had mixed motives of patriotism and economic self-interest. Christopher Prince, when he joined crews of New England privateers, wrote that he had two motives in mind. One was for the freedom of my country, and the other was to enjoy the luxuries of life. But if privateersmen were honest with themselves, I think they would say that they were mostly out for their own personal gain. If they wanted to really be totally patriotic, they would join the Continental Army and the Continental Navy, which often was short-staffed because so many young men were going off on privateers. But privateers did sometimes engage with powerful British ships and loyalist and British privateers. The captain of the Marlborough, we'll talk about, George Waite Babcock, had 5 attacks in combat with 5 British and other opposing privateers. So he did not shrink from combat. In the early years of the war, the Royal Navy really failed to protect its merchant fleet. As a result, American privateers easily seized hundreds of merchant ships sailing between Britain and the Caribbean and Canada. Soon, Providence became awash in surplus goods and supplies. The Reverend Everin Stiles of Newport wrote that some 40 prizes had been brought into Providence by October 1776, all but 3 of which had been sugar merchant ships. Young John Howland returned to Providence in early 1777. He had been performing grueling service in Washington's army that was often half-starved. He recalled, "The year 1776 was mostly employed in privateering, and many whom I had left in poor circumstances were now rich men. The wharves in Providence were crowded with large ships from Jamaica and other islands, loaded with rich products." Here's a map of Providence in 1776, and John Brown's Wharf would have been about right here. Now, while privateering was risky, the rewards could be phenomenal. I found out that looking at John Brown's records, it would cost him about $3,300 to supply and outfit a small privateer, just 8 cannon, maybe 30 or 40 men. But on the average, he could capture one ship that would be worth more than 9,000 pounds, almost today $450,000. Thus, one capture of a privateering voyage could easily pay for 2 or 3 more. Brown invested in 11 privateers in 76 and 77. He became rich. But warning signs were ahead. The days of easy conquests eventually ended. The powerful Royal Navy began protecting commercial vessels in convoys, began attacking privateers, throwing privateersmen in awful jails. Many died of malnutrition and disease. Brown decided in the second half of 1777 that he'd earned a lot of profits, and now he was going to invest them in a strong privateer, a large one that carried at least 20 cannon, which was a lot for a privateer. Such a privateer could avoid being taken by a British sloop of war and defeat an armed merchantman. He could never defeat a 32-gun frigate that the British had. And a lot of those were in the Caribbean. So he decided, well, what am I going to do? He had the brilliant idea of sending his new privateer to the coast of Africa. He figured correctly that the Royal Navy was overstretched. The Royal Navy had to cart the British Army around. It had to blockade ports like Newport. It sought privateers to capture. Most importantly, was watching for French invasion across the English Channel. So the Royal Navy had very few ships to send off to Africa to protect British slave trading forts there. It took an experienced privateer investor and a bold man to decide to send a privateer to distant Africa. In New England, there are lots of bold men in privateering, but Brown had one quality that the others didn't. He had a lot of experience with the slave trade. First, he came from Rhode Island, which was the state that dominated the slave trade. So he could speak with returning captains from Africa and find out, hey, are there any British ships there patrolling the coast? And if they're not, then they would have free reign attacking British interests. Second, Brown himself was an experienced slave trader. Prior to the Revolutionary War, he invested in 2 slave ships. One of them was an infamous one on the ship Sally, commanded by Esek Hopkins, one of Brown's sea ship captains. He would later become the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. But this particular slave voyage turned into one of the most deadly in North American history. Of the 196 Africans purchased by Hopkins, at least 109 perished on the voyage. Now, a slave trading voyage was daunting in part because a slave ship loaded with goods to trade for African captives was typically not large enough to carry all the food and water that the crew needed. The slave ship captain would have to obtain more food and water by trading with African chieftains. That was pretty daunting for a lot of American captains, but that didn't deter Brown because he had experience with it. Now, was Brown motivated to attack Britain, the world's leading slave trading country in Africa, from humanitarian impulses? No, clearly no. He did want to harm British economic interests and at the same time earn profits doing so. Now, a privateer that was sent to Africa could attack and plunder these forts, slave trading forts that Britain established. They like to put a lot of their merchandise there and goods that would be used to trade for slaves, warehouses of them. Then they would also keep the captives there, and a passing British slave ship could more efficiently buy a bunch at one time. So a privateer could raid there and really get a lot of prizes. They could also capture British slave ships that were on the coast trading at the time. If Brown was really fortunate, he figured his privateer could capture a large British slave ship filled with African captives just about to depart for the British Caribbean. So after spending possibly up to a year, they're about to finally take the voyage to the British Caribbean and earn all their profits. Brown could just step in, and then he would send the ship and the human cargo to a safe port, Charleston, Savannah, or perhaps a French island. There, the enslaved Africans on board would be sold, and that was the point. They would be sold as cargo, like any privateer cargo. And Brown and his investors hoped to really cash in. Now, a few other patriots had considered an expedition to Africa. One of them was John Paul Jones. He's known as one of the most famous Continental Navy heroes. While stationed in Newport in October 1776, Jones recommended to Congress that he would think it a good idea if he led a small expedition to Africa. And he was sure that, quote, his ships could carry all before them and give a blow to the English African trade, which would not soon recover. The expedition didn't get off the ground for various reasons, but Jones knew what he was talking about. As a young man, the first 2 voyages he took were slave voyages. The first one from Whitehaven, England, which was his hometown. Brown was also aware from reading newspapers that beginning in early 1777, American privateers started to capture British slave ships. American privateers would be based in French Martinique and other islands, Guadeloupe. They would go out for literally 1 or 2 hours, and these slave ships were just coming into Barbados or Antigua, and they would be captured. And then the American privateers would take them into the French-controlled islands and sell them to French planters there. At this point, the American privateersmen became slave traders. Now, Brown had a new 20-gun, three-masted brig constructed in Providence in 1777. He named his ship the Marlborough after the Duke of Marlborough, a descendant of Winston Churchill. Here's a great model that I think is probably what it looks like. This is from Hamburg, Germany. Now, to make the voyage a success, Brown had to find a courageous ship captain. And he found one in George Waite Babcock of Exeter, Rhode Island. The township of Exeter, as you all know here, is landlocked. It's known for modest stony farms back then, but it was close to a small private thriving port that's now called Wickford in North Kingstown. After moving to Wickford, Babcock formed a new independent unit, armed unit that was effective in damping down Tories. There was quite a lot of Tories in that area of around Wickford. He also served on as an officer on some privateers, including one as a lieutenant for one of Brown's privateers. Babcock would turn out to be a bold and sensible commander of the Marlborough, and I think one of the top privateer captains of the war. And most of the officers and men that were hired for this voyage came from Exeter and North Kingstown, men who knew and trusted Babcock. Here's the commission, signed signatures of Babcock and John Brown on the commission for the Marlborough. Here's something I'll just throw out there. I mean, blacks I call this a black privateersman, and blacks did serve on privateers, including Rhode Island. I came across one list of 60 privateersmen on a Rhode Island privateer, 3 of whom had African-sounding names, and so maybe even more served. Now, did any black privateers go on the Marlborough? No, I don't think, no evidence of that for good reason. Now this, as some of you might know, was originally owned by my father. He bought it in Charleston in 1972 or so. And it's appeared in several history books and museums. But he got a little suspicious and he had it x-rayed. Turns out the black skin was a fake. It was added on later. So the painting is actually original, 18th century. But it's of a white Frenchman, probably. But it's still valuable to show, that black people were privateers back in the Revolution. Now, at this time, Newport was occupied by the British Army, and Narragansett Bay was blockaded by Royal Navy ships. So Brown and Babcock had to figure out how to get the Marlborough to break through that blockade. They did so on a dark and stormy night on Christmas Eve in 1777. They went out the Sakana Channel, which was the most shallow channel, so the big British warships couldn't stay there. There was one that was there. Babcock actually got his ship grounded, and sometimes when you get a grounded ship, you start throwing off cannon, everything heavy to lighten up, and if he had done that, the voyage would have ended right there, but he was able to haul his ship off of the bank. Then he sailed on to Martha's Vineyard, where he enlisted more crew, and he finally departed for Africa on January 2nd, 1778. Here's a map of the movements down the Sakana Channel in particular. There was a British artillery point here, and this is where the British ship was down there. Thus began the extraordinary voyage of the Marlborough to Africa and back. What we know primarily about this voyage is from a ship's log kept by the captain's clerk, John Linscomb Boss, from Newport. And he dutifully recorded every day's events. Here's a picture of the cover page of that ship's log. Now, while I've spent a lot of time here tonight giving you the background, most of the book is about the voyage itself. It was a very interesting voyage, as you can imagine. How it was, and the people they met, where they went, the British ships they captured, the raid on the British fort. I don't have time to give all the details about that tonight, obviously, don't have the time. You'll have to read the book for that. I always say that in every lecture, I think. Suffice to say, it was a remarkable journey, and from Brown and Babcock's perspectives, a successful one. Here are some of the notable events that occurred in short form. The New England privateersmen were able to sack one of the top British slave trading forts in Africa. They also captured several armed British slave ships and sailed them as prize ships back to North America. One of them, when seized, had more than 300 African captives on board, and was about ready to sail for the British Caribbean, just as John Brown had hoped. Marlborough itself came back to New Bedford and had 26 enslaved people on board. Babcock captured several British slave ships with both African captives and free workers on board. Consistent with his privateering commission, he let the free workers go and kept the enslaved people as cargo. During their time on the West Coast, Babcock worked with several African leaders who cooperated with the New Englanders. One of them was named King Tom and had served as an intermediary for decades between British slave traders and in the interior in Africa. But this guy, got a lot of money from the British, but he decided, you know what, they're not my boss, I can do whatever I want. So he actually helped Babcock with some important intelligence. Several British slave captains captured by Babcock greedily agreed to cooperate with the Americans by giving them valuable intelligence, even though that amounted to treason. They were giving Americans useful information to harm Britain, but they were more interested in getting their slave ships back if they cooperated. Here's a good scene of the maritime world was definitely dominated by these canoes, African canoes. This is a painting by a British ship captains. This is showing Fonte warriors who have captured in a war these captives, and they're marching them to the coast. So in this particular area where Babcock went to, in the interior, Muslim army was attacking a lot of pagan tribes and trying to expand to Islam, but they were also sending a lot of captives to the coast to sell as enslaved people. Here's a picture of the British slave trading fort that Babcock actually and his crew sacked. So it would have had merchandise in these little places. They had places where you could make sails and anchors. Here's a British slave ship. Here's a map that I made to show the voyage of the Babcock, plus all the prize ships when they returned back to North America. There's also several original documents, not just the ship's log. This is orders by George Babcock to one of his lieutenants, Francis Bradfield, telling him where to, remember they captured that ship with 310 African captives on board. Very specific instructions where to send them to Martinique, go to these French commercial houses, get these terms. So very specific instructions. Now the Marlborough damaged the British slave trade more than any other American privateer. In the last chapter of my book, I argue that the actions of the officers and sailors of the Marlborough, as well as other American privateers who intercepted British slave ships, had a stunning unintended consequence. The British slave trade by 1778 had not only been disrupted, it had virtually disappeared. American privateersmen interfered with the conduct of the British slave trade to such an extent that British slave merchants substantially reduced what they would invest in the British slave trade. They didn't want to lose their investment. By 1778, the reduction was more than 70%. And as a result, during the early years of the Revolutionary War, the number of enslaved Americans forcibly shipped across the Atlantic Ocean declined dramatically. I estimate by about 60,000. That's quite a lot. This is the first book to detail and emphasize the role of American privateers in disrupting the British slave trade. I have a list in the exhibit to the book. 41 ships were captured by American privateers that had 11,000 enslaved people on board. Still, the officers in the Marlborough who intercepted these slave ships didn't have as their humanitarian goal helping the Africans, far from it. Still, their actions did substantially reduce the African slave trade and prevent tens of thousands of Africans from becoming enslaved in the New World. This was a positive impact, even if the reduction was both unintended and temporary. But of course, yeah, and as I did, obviously it was done for selfish reasons. They wanted to earn profits. They didn't show compassion for the captives or what they went through. They wanted to treat the captives as cargo and profit from them. So that kind of motive back then was offensive to some, but not to all. But today, obviously, it's repugnant. But you can look at the positive impact, 60,000 enslaved people not brought over, and you can look at the other side. So the privateersmen can be thus viewed as heroes or villains, or both. Thank you. I'll be glad to take any questions.
The painting that you showed that was owned by your father, I think, was painted, overpainted in black skin of a white person. Now, why would somebody want to do that?
Well, why would someone want to paint black skin over white skin? Those are very rare paintings to have a black person. There aren't that many painted images of black people from colonial times. On the other hand, he didn't pay that much for it. He paid about $1,100. So if it had been a real painting, it would be worth a lot more than that. But it's still very a nice image, and I plan to donate it probably to the Newport Historical Society.
Now, but why did the original
I don't know.
artist? Do you think it was?
It was in early 1970s. That was actually when Black History was just starting. So maybe he was interested in promoting Black history. But I never talked to the guy, so I don't know.
I had a question about the earlier slide that you had with the numbers of people that were slaves that were imported by various countries. That's an enormous number.
Yeah. Well, overall, the number of Africans carried in the slave trade was about 11 million. So that's just a massive number. Yeah.
And the other question is that every ship that traveled in the oceans had a log, right? So you could determine how many people were on board because of the ship's log.
Well,
always the case.
You're talking about the ship's log? Yes, if there are surviving ship's logs, you can often do that. There aren't that many that have survived. There is an excellent website called www.slavevoyages.org.
I saw that website.
Yeah, slavevoyages.org. And that actually has made an effort to list all of the slave voyages. I was happy to add to some, because some of the research I did they on the privateering. But that's an excellent website.
Where did the Marlborough end up?
Where did the Marlborough end up? It sailed into New Bedford, and then it was sold to Boston investor. I don't know what happened later. A lot of these large privateers almost all of them were captured by British warships. So it was probably ultimately captured at some point.
And what was the length of that one?
What was the length? I think it was 118 feet and about 38 feet wide. So 6 feet in the holds. So not big. There was a small speck in the ocean. The actual ship's log, I got a PDF from the Naval History Department. They were kind enough to send that to me. The original was supposed to be in the National Historical Museum at Monmouth, Morristown in New Jersey. So I called them up and asked for it. They said they couldn't find it. The original is missing, so probably someone stole it, or they just have lost it. So. Any more questions? Thank you for attending, and I'd be glad to sign a book for you. Thank you.